I thought it would be the best to introduce Mako's book, Art+Faith, A Theology of Making. When I first read this book, I think the title was really provocative to me. Not the Art+Faith part, because it's the integration of faith and work, and I lived that world for a long time, but a theology of making. What does that even mean? So this is a book that I highly recommend, and I'm totally not biased. But I have a funny story about this. When this was published in January of 2020, there was, January 2021. So it was at the heart of the pandemic and the lockdown. And we got an early copy, and I said to myself, I am going to be a really helpful wife. I am going to put on my critics, editors' glasses, and I'm going to read this book, and then I'm going to give Mako constructive feedback. Really redemptive feedback, because a lot of people will praise, this writing, and so I said, okay, I need to be the helpful wife. So I told him that before I started reading, to give him a little bit of a warning, and I started reading, and I did give him my feedback at every single chapter, but it was the same feedback at the end of every single chapter. And the true story, I told him, I am falling in love with you all over again. Because this was not only a beautifully written book, but really, really important book. So I really wanted to share this with you this morning. So to kick it off, Mako, what is a theology of making?
Well, first of all, thanks for asking that question. We sit behind these panels, which is such a privilege as a visual artist to participate in worship. And part of this portal that artists get to create is to think about God as the artist. And if you just read the first few sentences of Genesis 1, that's what you come away with. God is the creator, and in common vernacular, the closest occupation that God will be described as will be as an artist. Now, I say in the book that God is perhaps the only true artist, and so I flipped the definition to recontextualize what we do in making in light of what God has done. But what God has done, the Hebrew word there is bara, to create, is not just a sense of creativity and imagination and making that we have, which is housed in material reality. It's just housed in a closed loop of nature, as it were. But what God has done is to create as a movement, in a sense, of this ushering in of creating, certainly out of ex nihilo, out of nothingness, but even the concept of nothingness is part of this reality of God as the artist with a capital A.
So you talk about creation, and I think the Genesis 1 and 2 creation story that we probably read a million times, I think I always read, until I read this book, as something that, this is what God did, and bring forth this life into this world and give us life, and create this relationship. So it was all about what God did. And I don't think, I even question myself, the how God created the world question. And you talk about in this book, Mako, that when God created, he sang into the creation. And that really prompted me, and I actually went further. Would God create like singing into the creation? Or would God have created with dances and songs and this excitement. And so that actually gives us opportunity to imagine, the creation story. And when we think about that moment, I think we think about certain assumptions that is attached to that creation that relates to your theology of making. So I'm going to read a paragraph from this book. It says on page 18, God exists outside of time and space. We can all agree to that. Not needing to create this world. Some have called this the aseity of God, from a Latin a, from, and says, self. So why did God create? Now you're talking about the why question. Our view of the creative process and the role of art hinges upon how we answer this question. God created out of love. God created because it is in God's nature to make and create. The theology of making assumes that God created out of abundance and exuberance, and the universe and we exist because God loves to create. Some will misunderstand what I just stated and ask, why isn't there a purpose behind creation or purpose in the cosmos? Yes, but this purposefulness goes far deeper than in the industrial sense. Please explain that.
So, excuse me. This concept of aseity, which is a theological term that describes God's being as separate from creation, right? There is what they call creature-creator distinction. We live in this reality of closed natural world. And so from our perspective, what is supernatural, miraculous, seems very difficult to embrace, or it becomes something that is separate from normality. But in this picture of aseity, right? So imagining that God is all about love, and everything God does is to create in love, because love is generative, love creates all the time. And when we begin to think, basically flip from our perspective to biblical perspective, which is from God's perspective, what is creation? Creation is a feast of abundance. It has always been from the beginning about what we would describe as a wedding feast. It is the establishment of the abundance of who God is into God's creation. It is manifested in everything that we see in the world, that even after the fall, this remnants of Eden points us to this uber abundant reality of love. So when we place our trust in that perspective, it is a presupposition. Many people struggle with this, and so it's a leap of faith to both embrace that and to live into that. But I found that as a follower of Christ, that this is essentially what you're called into, and we'll talk about the Eucharist, but it is fundamentally an invitation, an invocation for us to create into this superabundance, this reality that God has created. Even before time existed, this reality was what we come out of.
The theology of making that you talk about in this book is very much related to your idea, or the idea of co-creation and co-creation with God. And briefly, this is what you write in here. God's design in Eden, even before the fall, was to sing creation into being and invite God's creatures to sing with God, to co-create into the creation. A narrative of our own creation is embedded in creation. The Christian narrative is all about the new, all about the beginning. And part of that ushering of the new is God's maker in us, calling imagination, which makes us unique in the animal kingdom. We can create into creation something unique and particular. Thus, in Genesis 2, we see Adam's first act of creativity, naming the animals. And I think many of us in here have named others, whether our children, our pets, our hobbies, our beloved, objects at home. We have gone through that creativity in our daily living, even beyond naming. So, and then you talk about Eucharist and how that's also related to co-creation. You have this beautiful example of a sandcastle on the beach. So can you speak into those?
Right, these terms, right, we have to rely on metaphors and creative expression. Some of us got to see Macbeth yesterday on stage. And, there's a creator who wrote the play and actors who enacted, and all of it is naming, right? Naming of conditions of history, reality, stories, that intrigues us, characters that seem so much embedded in humanity and woes and struggles, and that we resonate with those things that are made and named. But part of the great thing about theater is that we get to be participant in the new act of making, right? So when the play was written by Shakespeare a long time ago, it is reenacted and made to make new on stage yesterday, and we are able to respond, right, in another act of naming, by responding to that in some way, and talking about it, and inhabiting that way of imagination. And so if you use that metaphor, we need to understand the gospel and this, what I call sanctified imagination, that leads straight to the table, as you noted, table of sacrifice, table of this redemptive act of giving, Christ giving his life for us. All that is part of the drama, theodrama, that we get to participate in here at All Saints every week, and really every day. So one of the examples I use is this describing a sandcastle made by a little boy at the beach. And we know that the sandcastle is going to be washed away by the waves when the tidal waves come. But this boy meticulously creates this beautiful castle. Now, imagine, and typically I was writing this as a way to describe how Christians see creation, right? So we say, well, art really doesn't matter, it's gonna get washed away. There'll be, some will say it will be burned up, so why spend so much money on, Shakespeare? But my answer to that is, no, you have the story flipped. You're thinking about human-centric way of judging what matters out of scarcity and fear and anxiety, when we should be really looking at the superabundance of God from the beginning, an aseity God, which allows God to exist outside of time and space. And yet, right, the beauty is that the incarnation of Jesus becoming one of us, again, this is a drama that flips the table into independence to dependence. So boy creating a sandcastle. The sandcastle is this beautiful castle that will be washed away. But imagine if his father is an architect and he's looking at this sandcastle and admiring it and saying, wow, my boy has created something that even I can't create. But he's an architect, so he takes his boy one day and takes him to a land and empty place, and then he says, I'm going to build a sandcastle because I'm an architect. I have the ability and will to build what you have built, thinking that it was only temporary. It was only, this act of play, of naming, but I'm going to make it permanent. And so that metaphor is something that we can think about. When God sees us creating in love, we are God's children. Anything that we do, especially in excellence, God will look at it as something that is worthy of not only attention, but creating something more enduring than we can ever possibly imagine or think. Now, that takes quite a bit of leap there, which many people would say, well, that's nice to dream about, or it's kind of a fantasy. But no, biblical narrative points to this. Throughout scriptures points to this, and I make sure that with my theologian friends, I point out those things, and N.T. Wright, renowned theologian, whose theology I rely on often to make this point. The scriptures is all about making something new. As you noted, it's not the end, apocalyptic end of the world, as much as it is signifying God's power to renew the world with sanctifying fire rather than destructive fire that we place upon ourselves. So, sandcastle, now, one more to deep. Father, who is an architect, creates this castle. Imagine if the Father had the ability, as we may soon, to recreate the inorganic material of the sand. Let's say we have a way to create this completely new material out of sand. And because the boy is, by faith, in a sense, creating a sandcastle that he sees as beautiful, the Father, who has this capacity, has now the ability to not only make that permanent, but also something that moves beyond what the sand itself can do. And thereby you're creating, in a sense, a new world out of what the boy created, but it's still dependent on what the boy created, right? So God's humility is to, through Jesus, come down to us and be present in a very broken, fallen reality of materiality that is in front of us, but at the same time has the capacity to create something that we make into new creation.
So that reminds me of J.R.R. Tolkien's Leaf by Nigel, a really, really important short story, and how this artist faithfully painted one leaf, and out of that, God has created the entire forest. And I think the importance of making, I think, is we actually see that and live that every week at All Saints when we do the Eucharist. And when we do Eucharist, God has actually invited us to first make the bread and the wine, and God waits until we make to show up. And it's that part of co-creation that we get to be reminded of at every Sunday here at All Saints. So when I think about that, now of course, we have so much of technology and access to food sources that I don't really think about making bread and making wine myself. But if I really pause and think about how difficult that is to make really good bread and really good wine, and how that takes generations, it really surprises me that that's what God chose as element for us to come before the table, to be reminded of actually the cosmic wedding to come. So with that, I know you and I have written a book to be published in spring of 2026 on the theme of beauty and justice, and how beauty and justice are the flip side of the same coin of the truth, the gospel. And if you can briefly tell us about the last book that was published is Art and Faith in Theology of Making. You have another book coming out called Art Is, and then we have this book coming out, Art Plus, of Beauty times Justice. What will be a connection, briefly, between a theology of making and beauty and justice?
So let's assume that, carrying the sandcastle metaphor further, that everything we do is making. And that in some ways we need to be liberated from our concept of making something that is only purposeful and utility driven to something that God sees in us, has embedded in us, which is this playful act of imagination. And we don't think about imagination in terms of worship a lot. We think, well, that's not something we create into worship, but we have to exercise this, again, sanctified imagination if we are to take bread and wine and transmute that by faith into the body of Christ and the sacrificial blood of Christ poured into us. And we, as Paul writes, is new creation. In Christ, we are new creation. So as we enact this theodrama that is taking place in front of us, and as we inhabit that story, that good story, which is the gospel, and we live into that reality, and that means our lives become part of God's story of the good news into the world, then justice has to be part of beauty. And so beauty and justice are both flip side of the same coin, in a sense that every time we long for this new creation, we have this longing, hunger for a world that is shalom, is fully, again, abundant world of relationships and communities that is pointed to true, good, and beautiful, then justice is obviously part of that. Most of the time we talk about those two themes, beauty and justice, separately, but we have come to believe that they are indeed intricately connected. Without beauty, there is no true justice, when you think about it, because restitution and way that we seek to right the wrongs is a noble and necessary effort, but at the end of the day, the victim that is not going to get back what was lost in injustice. And the only way that we have found, and this film will show that, is to find beauty in traumatized and lives of people who have been victimized by oppression and darkness and trauma becoming beautiful. And that same thing can be said of beauty, that beauty really without justice remains the sentimental adornment of the past. In order for beauty to speak into the world with resonance, it has to cause this movement of the spirit, really, that allows us, maybe deepens the longings that we have for a just world.